All right, guys, we're here in the UK. It's been far, far overdue. We're talking Brexit. All right, guys, welcome into the program. Today, we're going to be talking about probably one of the most important issues for me geographically right now, being in the UK, and that is Britain's decision to exit the European Union. Recently, the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, actually triggered Article 50, which signaled that the UK will exit the EU in 2 years' times. During this 2 years, there is going to be a massive negotiation between the UK and the EU about the terms of this, shall we say, not so amicable divorce. And so what I'm not going to talk about today is the issues that led to Brexit. There's so much literature out there about what led to Brexit. And actually, way back at the beginning of this channel, I did some episodes on why people were voting for Trump in the United States. A lot of those reasons applied to why people were voting against Britain's continued membership in the EU. The question I want to address today is, what is this going to look like moving forward? What is it going to look like for the people of Britain, particularly the people who voted to exit the EU? Now, we have to start off and say that the decision to leave the EU was, by and large, not the decision favored by many of the academics, many of the working professionals, many of the political elite on both parties. And so this was very much a groundswell support, a groundswell movement, particularly from people who were in the north of England and outside major cities like London. So with that as a background, let's tackle some of the issues that are coming for Britain as it exits the EU. Now, what everyone needs to know, if you're going to take away one thing from this episode, take away this. The EU has every incentive to make Britain's exit from the EU very painful for Britain. Why does the EU want to make Britain's exit from the EU so painful? Because it wants to discourage other states, like the Netherlands, like France, like any other EU member state, from actually exiting the EU. That is, if the EU can make this exit so painful for Britain, it's going to signal to the rest of Europe, yeah, it might be difficult being in the EU, but it's going to be much worse if you're outside the EU. Now, there's so many issues that Britain and the EU are going to have to hammer out in the process of this next 2 years of negotiations. Certain things that I want to flag are, firstly, what's going to happen to those EU citizens that are currently residing in Britain? What's going to happen to those British citizens that are currently residing in EU member states? Are they going to continue to enjoy the same status in the different countries that they live in? Or because of Britain's exit, is there going to have to be some changes into the citizenship requirements, into the migration requirements, to the residency requirements? Very important issue, because there are millions, literally millions of EU nationals living in Britain right now. What's their destiny going to be? Likewise, there's hundreds of thousands of Britons living in continental Europe. What's their destiny going to be? And if they're not going to be kicked out, if they're going to stay, do they still enjoy the same rights, the same access to pensions and benefits? Another thing to consider, is Britain going to have access to the single market? Most people think they're not going to have access to the single market, the European Union market, the largest market in the world. To have unimpeded single market access, Britain has to relinquish some of its control over migration. Now, because migration was one of the cornerstones of Brexiteers' arguments for leaving the European Union, doesn't make much sense for Britain to allow the EU to mandate what kind of migration policies Britain should have so that Britain can stay in the single market. So, in my eyes, it would be very difficult for Britain to stay in the single market. Likewise with the customs union, and likewise with passporting. What is passporting? Basically, the ability for banks headquartered or operating in London to engage in European banking across the continent and make that have ease of access. That passporting is going to be lost because, again, to have passporting, migration policies you have to agree to from the centralized EU facilities. And so you've already seen many different banks starting to inquire and start to make some moves from London, draining from London back into the continent. I saw just the other day that Lloyd's from London is going to open up an office, a subsidiary office in Brussels, because they need to have access to that European market because it's so lucrative, it's so large. Another thing to flag is that the EU, and this is one of the biggest arguments that people don't like the EU, is an incredibly dense, bureaucratic establishment institution. Now, because of this, so many different facets of British life and European life have been given over to EU regulations. I mean, if you want a visual representation of how much the EU is bureaucratic, how many rules and regulations in different sectors of society, just think of a tangled, balled up cord like your headphones. When you pull out your headphones and they're balled up in a cord, just think of that, but instead of a 2-foot long cord, think of a 10-mile long cord. How entangled and how enmeshed and how massive and gargantuan the bureaucracy is of the European Union. To disentangle from that bureaucracy and then importantly to replace the functions of that bureaucracy from the EU back into Britain is going to require immense amount of work, planning, and the creation of the recreation of new agencies within Britain. So this disentangling of the bureaucracy, very difficult. Another thing that should be flagged up, Britain has signed on to in the past has allocated funds to the EU, many tens of billions of dollars worth. One of the key sticking points of the negotiation between the EU and the UK will be how much of this money is the UK going to have to pay the EU moving forward. Some people have said it's going to be upwards of $50 billion that the UK is just going to have to fork out to the EU because of all of the future things that Britain has signed up for funding. Now, that's going to be in the next 2 years. So you're thinking, well, that sounds absolutely ridiculous. Why would people in the UK vote to leave and have to go through all this trouble and be diminished in their market access, be diminished in their trade access? Tariffs are going to go up. Why would someone leave this? Well, here's the argument that people make. Some people in Britain will say, yes, in the short term, it's going to be hard. There's going to be consequences, there's going to be costs. But in the long term, Britain is now freed up to go around the world, to go to China, to go to India, to go to South Asia, to go to East Asia, to craft free trade agreements and to make more competitive, more British advantageous free trade agreements than they would if they were within the EU. Why is this? The EU is notoriously hard on things like human rights and the environment. Yes, those pesky human rights. I know the EU just wants to make sure people aren't killed, worked literally to death while they're in factories. If you're the UK now, you don't have to worry about these pesky human rights problems. You don't have to worry about these pesky environmental problems. You can just sign free trade agreements without having to go through the very laborious, and it is laborious, and it is difficult, and it is maddeningly frustrating process of having all other 27 member states give their yay or nay towards this free trade agreement. So it gives Britain the ability to make much more competitive free trade agreements, much quicker, much faster, and much more efficient. And that is a positive, some would say. Some others wouldn't say. Environmentalists, human rights advocates wouldn't say. But that is a positive that Britain will necessarily have to use if it wants to maintain any type of prominence. So this is the sort of core issue within the EU itself and all of its member states, not just the UK. It's this desire for, on the one hand, sovereignty for the individual states like Britain or like Germany or like France to be able to dictate their own policies on a wide range of different issues, most notably recently on migrants and refugees, these types of things. So on the one hand, you have this desire that all countries have, all states have, to maintain their sovereignty, their ability to make their own policy. While on the other hand, states have this desire for integration because they've seen the benefits, the positive outcomes of increased integration, particularly for the economies and for the free movement of goods and trade within these different countries. So it's this tension within the EU of sovereignty on the one hand, integration on the other hand, and the EU's notoriously slow-moving, bureaucratic, sometimes ridiculous regulations. And so yes, there are fundamental problems at the core of the European Union between its bureaucratic ridiculousness and the loss of certain parts of sovereignty. A favorable reading of what the UK did is UK voters sat back and said, you know what? We can go it alone in this international world. We don't need to be tethered to the EU. We want to make our own destiny. We want to make our own free trade agreements. We want to be able to basically fashion Britain's identity in the world, not tethered to the EU. And so we'll see. We'll see if Britain can do it. The EU doesn't want to see Britain tank. That would have very bad effects on continental Europe. But nonetheless, access to the single market, passporting for banks, these types of things, very difficult, very difficult. And it'll be very interesting to see if Britain can navigate these very rough waters in the 2 years and then the 10 years ahead. All right, guys, what do you think of Brexit? Do you think it was a good idea? Do you think it was a bad idea? What do you think the outcome of Brexit is going to be for Britain over the short and long term? Short term, I think it's just going to be pretty bad. I don't see any way around it. I think it's going to be pretty painful for the next 2 to 4 years. In the long term, who knows? Maybe it'll be good. Maybe they'll be so wounded from the 2 or 4 year divorce that they'll never be to the position they were in the early 2000s, late 1990s, because Britain was very powerful economically. But we'll see. What do you think? Comment below, let me know, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and remember guys, reality always trumps ideology.